Again, my name is Walter Hatch. I teach East Asian politics mostly. I have a long-time interest in East Asia. And today I want to talk about Japan's relationship with this part of the world. So Japan did some pretty awful things in the 1930s and 40s when it was trying to disrupt the leadership of East Asia, trying to dominate East Asia. In China, which it tried to conquer, Japanese troops massacred thousands of Chinese civilians, including those whose bones were recovered here and put on display at the Massacre Museum in Nanking. It also conducted perverse medical experiments on live Chinese patients. In Korea, the Japanese colonial authority tortured and murdered Korean activists who were calling for independence. Throughout its sprawling empire, Japan pushed Asian women to serve as prostitutes for Japanese military troops. Today, the country's brutal past haunts its relations with its neighbors in the region. Territorial disputes, even those over mostly uninhabitable rocks like Dokdo, have been inflamed with passions informed by history. Chinese and Korean citizens really, truly, many of them hate Japan, and many believe that the land of anime is once again determined to try to conquer the rest of East Asia militarily. In Beijing and Seoul, the complaints are issued every single day in loud and angry voices. Japan, they say, has not honestly confronted its wartime behavior. Even in the United States, in Australia or the UK, you hear the same message, often in words drenched in biblical scripture. Japan, they say, has not been sufficiently penitent. It has not sufficiently atoned for its sins. Now, I'll be the first to say right here that there is some truth in this. Right-wing members, a few of them, of the ruling Liberal Democratic Party have indeed tried to whitewash Japan's past. There are some ultra-nationalists, maybe even a few of these fine gentlemen dressed in World War II military garb at the infamous Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo. Maybe even some ultra-nationalists will argue that the Nanking Massacre, for example, never happened. They might say that it was a fabrication of the Chinese Communist Party. Others, including this fine gentleman I came across in Tokyo just last summer, deny that women throughout the region, half of them, more than half of them, from Korea, were forced to serve as sex slaves to the Japanese military. His sign, by the way, says that it is a violation of Japanese human rights to make such outlandish claims. For the most part, in my view, the criticism of Japan is unfair. First of all, if by Japan we're talking about the state executive of Japan, Japan has indeed apologized many times for its militarist past. These apologies, in fact, go all the way back to 1982. The most significant statement of contrition on the part of Japan was offered by Prime Minister Murayama, this gentleman, in 1995 on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. He went on television to express what he called his deep sadness, his deep remorse for the terrible damage and suffering caused by Japanese colonial rule, by Japanese aggression to many peoples throughout East Asia, particularly Chinese and Koreans. Since then, every single Japanese prime minister has reaffirmed the 1995 Murayama statement. Every single Japanese prime minister has expressed a statement of apology. And we need to ask, what about other leaders? For example, school teachers. Have they properly taught Japanese citizens about their own past? Well, I lived in Japan in the late 1990s, and my children, who are half Japanese, attended public schools there. And I very carefully read their Japanese history textbooks. And I have to say to you that I was pleasantly surprised to learn that these history textbooks that my children had to read honestly talked about Japan's military past. And I would argue that these textbooks honestly dealt with Japan's past in more detail and with more forthrightness than my own US history textbooks did, dealing with issues like the genocide of Native Americans in this country, the horrible history of slavery in the United States, the textbooks that I read as a kid growing up in the United States. So this brings me to a second point about Japan's relationship with its past and its relationship with its neighbors. I would argue that Japan has done more than many other states, including the United States, in acknowledging and apologizing for its past misdeeds. Where, for example, is the U.S. apology for its aggression in Vietnam, for the U.S. use of chemical defoliants like napalm, for the destruction of entire villages in Vietnam in the search for communist sympathizers? Where, again, is the U.S. apology for its illegal invasion of Iraq, for its use of torture and humiliation against Iraqi prisoners in places like Abu Ghraib? No one seems to be demanding from the United States an official apology for these kinds of misdeeds, and certainly no one in the United States is expressing any profound remorse for U.S. actions. Now, imagine if any leader of the United States, say, for example, the President of the United States, Barack Obama, were in fact to apologize for U.S. actions in the past. Can you imagine the reaction back home in the United States? Well, you don't even have to imagine, because this is actually happening in real time, has been happening for a while, and is happening just this past week. Critics are loudly accusing President Obama of maybe rhetorical treason or of, quote, not loving America, unquote. This was something that Rudy Giuliani just said the other day, the former mayor of New York. And what did Obama do? He said things like that the United States may not have been always perfect in its past deeds, in its dealings with other states. So this brings me to my third and last point, which is very simply, states are not people. States can reconcile with one another without engaging in those dramatic acts of contrition, without engaging in genuflection before another. Consider the case of Germany. Yes, of course, it apologized to the state of Israel, the new state of Israel, in the late 1940s, early 1950s, for the uniquely horrible crimes, war crimes that today we call the Holocaust. But Germany only belatedly apologized to its neighbors in Europe for its brutal acts of aggression against those countries. Germany's reluctance did not stop France from forging a new and very close relationship with West Germany. Just recall for a second now that Germany, and before that Prussia, invaded France 3 times between 1870 and 1940. French citizens came to distrust and hate the Germans. They viewed the Germans as warlike barbarians, horrible people, right? But what happened? So if we go back to 1954, you can see here in this graph that not even 10% of French citizens could bring themselves to say that Germany, that they had a positive opinion of Germany back in 1954. But here you see that in 1964, just a decade later, more than half of French citizens felt something positive, had a good opinion of West Germany, despite that history of brutal conquest that Germany had engaged in and that French citizens had suffered from. So what changed in just that decade? Well, one thing we know for sure did not happen. German leaders did not engage in any kind of apology tour. Chancellor Adenauer, like most Germans in those days, had very little desire to dwell on the past. He and others were mostly mum about Germany's past misdeeds. So were textbooks in Germany. Sure, they talked a lot about Goethe and Bach, but when it came to Germany's military, those German textbooks didn't talk about Prussian generals, imperial stormtroopers from World War I. They didn't talk about the Nazi SS Waffen. Yes, Germany eventually did discover its own past. It did apologize to its European neighbors, but this came much later, really in the 1970s, when a new generation of young German leaders took power. This was the generation of Willy Brandt, the Social Democrats who took power in the 1970s. What brought Germany and France together was the European Union, not apologies, not dramatic acts of contrition. The two countries learned to trust one another, to cooperate, first on economic issues, like the production of coal and steel in the Ruhr Valley, later on issues of cross-border trade, later still on issues of foreign policy towards the rest of the world. Franco-German reconciliation, in other words, happened because of acts of cooperation, because of deeds, not because of words, not because of pretty language about apologies. This can happen in East Asia as well. This kind of reconciliation, this improvement that happened in Franco-German relations can happen, for example, with Chinese-Japanese relations. China and Korea can learn to trust Japan, even to like the Japanese, can you imagine? But more partnership is necessary, more cooperation, more agreements to pool sovereignty, like the Germans have done in Europe through the EU. It would help, I acknowledge, if Prime Minister Abe, the current right-wing Prime Minister in Japan, were less busy trying to rewrite history. That is a problem. It would help if he quit doing that. But it would help even more if Japan were able to forge agreements with China and Korea to cooperate on significant issues of mutual concern, like cross-border trade. What's standing in the way? What's stopping this from happening? Well, I hope I don't sound anti-American here, but I have to say, one of the major obstacles to cooperation, to reconciliation in East Asia is the United States, which really tries to control Japan, both militarily and politically, which keeps Japan under its thumb. The US treats Japan as a subordinate, a junior partner in its relations with the rest of East Asia. Just a couple of examples. In the early 1990s, Japan wanted to join a regional organization called the East Asian Economic Group. And the US didn't like the idea and pushed Japan to back out because the US hadn't been invited to be a party to that economic group. Then in the late 1990s, Japan proposed something called the Asian Monetary Fund, a system to try to help regional economies facing financial distress. And the US demanded that Japan give up that idea, mostly because it would function as a competitor to the IMF, with which the United States controls. So Japan did, in fact, abandon the Asian Monetary Fund idea. I would argue that until Japan learns to act on its own, until it's able to act on its own, until the United States allows Japan to be an equal sovereign partner, like any other sovereign state in the world, the Chinese and the Koreans are unlikely to take Japan seriously. And until that time, I would argue, reconciliation is very unlikely to come to East Asia. So let me encourage you, finally, that the next time one of your Chinese, Korean, or American friends says to you, the Japanese don't acknowledge their past sufficiently, they're not honest about their own history, I would encourage you to do three things. One is to ask them, do you know about the Murayama Statement? Do you know about Japan's statements of contrition? Secondly, ask them, how does Japan compare with other countries that have committed misdeeds? Have those countries apologized? Why is Japan being expected to do, for example, what no one expects the United States to do, and that is apologize for its past misdeeds? And finally, I would ask you to consider the possibility that reconciliation can happen without words. It happens through action, through deeds, through acts of cooperation, partnership, that those fine flourishes of rhetoric may not be necessary for Japan to regain the trust of its East Asian partners. Thank you very much.